Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Dale DeCesare, and I am with Regional Education Lab for the central region of the country. And I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar, which is focused on a multi-state survey of district leaders regarding their mentoring policies for new teachers. This work came about because it was identified as a need by the members of our alliance, an area that we'll talk about a little bit more as we go into the webinar. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about the key goals we have for the webinar. So there's four things we'd like to do today. First, I want to do a quick review of some of the research background on mentoring, things like impacts on teachers and students. Because that was one of the key reasons underpinning the work and really helped inform the design of the survey, as we'll talk about. So I'll spend a little bit of time briefly talking about that. We want to talk about how REL Central collaborated with the 5 states that released the survey, because an overarching goal of the REL is to not just to conduct studies, but actually to work with people in the field to get them familiar with research-based practices for collecting data so that they can continue to do those things on their own, even without the REL if they want to. Third, we're going to review the key findings that were in the report. There was a lot more data that was collected by the surveys that the states released. And we distilled some kind of the key and some of the most interesting pieces into the report. And those pieces are what we're going to talk about today. And then finally, the last kind of half of the webinar, which I'm really looking forward to, is we will have three leaders from 3 of the states that released the survey to kind of have a discussion about what the work means to them in their settings, and to get their input as experts in the field. So we can go to the next slide. So when we talk about research background, one of the things we know, looking at studies in the field, is that new teachers, especially those in their first 2 years, are just less effective than their more experienced peers. And what that means is, turnover and having ways of enhancing teacher retention, really become critical pieces for districts and states. That was one of the underlying factors for why we wanted to focus on mentoring in general. So other studies have found positive effects of mentoring, including effects on student achievement and teacher retention generally. And most recently, a very interesting longitudinal study which looked at a cohort of teachers over the last 5 years, found significant differences in terms of retention for teachers who had received a mentor, a first-year mentor, and those who hadn't. After 5 years, the difference in the groups was around 86% of those who had a mentor were still in teaching versus 71% after 5 years. And those, represent a significant investment again in having to districts having to invest resources in hiring and training, mentoring and inducting new teachers, and having several years where those teachers are just going to be kind of less effective in general as they learn their profession. We have some research that indicates mentors in the same field can have a positive impact on teachers, as opposed to teachers being served by mentors who work in a different field. And obviously that's linked to expertise in the same topic areas that the mentee teacher is teaching. Looking at full-time mentors, research suggests that teachers served by full-time mentors show greater performance gains than their peers. And those findings, at least in the study that we cite here, held true regardless of whether higher need students were being served. So this is an important piece that we'll talk about later, because the survey did ask questions about whether mentors had release time from their typical teaching duties. And again, why we want to talk about some of this research background is because when we go to look at the survey findings, we'll see areas where what's happening out in the field does not necessarily align with what research might suggest, can contribute to higher retention and student performance. Looking at 2 years of mentoring support, there's several studies that indicate having 2 full years of support has an impact on how effective teachers are in getting higher student performance. One of those studies, the Glazerman study, was actually a randomized trial study, which is sort of the highest level impact study that you can conduct, and that one in particular found it did not find the impacts after 1 year. It was only after 2 years had been provided of mentoring could they trace impacts on student performance. So that piece is something to think about, and it's something we asked about in the survey. Observation, the importance of making sure that mentors have the opportunity to observe their mentees' instruction is also something that's been found to be important. It's critical for mentors to be able to diagnose instruction challenges. And it's just something that the state and district leaders we talked to when we designed the survey said was something that was important, and they were interested in terms of what types of policies are in place to ensure that mentors have a chance to observe their mentees. Mentor training, I think, is a piece that resonates with most people. It's something that the training and experience that mentors have in supporting new teachers is important in their ability to be as effective as possible in supporting new teachers. There's a number of national organizations, such as the National Association of State Boards of Education, that identify a need for mentors to meet rigorous either training requirements or having evidence of at least 3 years of experience teaching before they serve as mentors. And so we wanted to ask that question on the survey. Do districts have policies requiring that those who serve as mentors have training? Use of stipends. There has been some research that shows having a financial support for mentors just makes that role, elevates that role in terms of importance, and that where there's a lack of stipends for mentors, there's sort of adverse effects on perceptions regarding teacher longevity and teacher effectiveness and the effectiveness of mentors. So that was another question we put into the survey. One thing we would note on any of this research background is that many of the studies involving mentoring use non-experimental designs, which means they're not done through randomized trials. And that just points to the need for more high-level research on the area. And where there is high-level research, such as the randomized trial I pointed out a couple moments ago around the importance of 2 years of mentoring, that we should take note of those findings in particular. So just a little bit of background, through the Research Alliance that I mentioned at the beginning that REL Central ran, we had numerous conversations with our Alliance Steering Committee, with state and district leaders in the field, and a consistent challenge that folks are reporting is the need for quality teaching and to be able to find cost-effective ways to address persistent turnover and staffing challenges, particularly in urban and rural areas, and areas that serve large percentages of high-need students. In some of these areas, our members are reporting turnover as high as 40 to 50% of teachers in their first 5 years, and that represents a major investment loss in, as we said earlier, training, hiring, and all those pieces that districts invest. And where we can identify strategies that do have research support, it becomes even more important to understand whether or not those strategies are being used, and if they're not, why not? And in our region, there is a strong tradition of local control where districts really get to decide a lot of the policy and how it's implemented within a constrained resource environment for all their teachers, including new teachers. And states in particular don't always have access to information about what what is going on at the district level. And that lack of data, lack of existing data on school district policies was a key driving force for why we thought this survey was useful and why the state leaders in particular wanted to have it. And it was, data that can be used to have important conversations about policy differences across districts. We have one question here that just came in. I'll just jump to that asks, when you say turnover, are you talking about teachers leaving the profession or their school district? And that's a great question. Just in general, just in terms of definitions, as we talk about this, when we talk about mentors, we're talking about folks who are working in particular with new teachers. That's sort of different from coaches, instructional coaches that might work with all teachers across the staff, including new teachers. We're talking specifically about new teachers. And when we talk about mentees, we're talking about teachers in their first year with the district. And in terms of turnover, what we were talking about is leaving the district, because that to the district was the loss of investment that they had in trying to keep their teachers. So that sort of, I just kind of talked about the first goal that we had, sort of reviewing the research background and the purpose for the survey. I wanted to talk a little bit about the process we went through, because it was pretty extensive in how we helped states develop the survey. And our model here was to support states to create a common instrument across the 5 states, but that the survey would belong to them. And the survey instrument belongs to each of the state agencies that released it, and that that way they could have access to all the data and use it the way they saw fit. But we wanted to make sure there was a defensible process in creating it. And we used the slide you see here, sort of a 5-step process where we wanted to make sure there were clear goals, that we knew who the respondents were supposed to be, that the question forms were clear and understandable, that there was a structure to the survey, and that we could do a limited amount of evaluation before it was released to make sure there weren't any problems. And I'll talk about each one of these steps in the next few slides. So in terms of goals, we had these questions. Who provides mentoring? How does mentoring time change after the first year? Are there requirements that mentors observe? Are there training requirements, stipends? And are there barriers to implementing mentoring? And again, these all play off of the research that I just talked about in terms of things like importance of observing mentees and importance of training. Those became kind of our guiding questions. We talked quite a bit about who we should target for the survey. And what we decided was, because there are surveys out there that focus on teachers or school level administrators, what we decided was to try and get one response for each district in the states that released the survey. And the process we used was to send it to the superintendent and ask them to have one person in the district who is most familiar with the mentoring program take the survey. In most cases, it ended up being the superintendent. In some cases, it was another district administrator who was directly responsible for new teacher induction. But I wanted to make it clear that we had one response per district was our model. The question forms themselves were informed. REL Central did a search to see what other publicly available and published surveys were out there, just to give us an idea of types of questions. And there was a range in terms of the length and areas of focus, but doing that search was very useful in that it gave us kind of a reference or a framework to look at when we were designing the current survey. And in the end, what we used was sort of a modified mix of some existing questions from surveys that were out there and brand new questions that our Alliance members were interested in. The survey structure, the 4 kind of main areas of the survey: 1 was, what are the goals that districts identify for their mentoring programs? 2, what were the components of district mentoring programs? 2 was the biggest section of the survey and is what we'll talk about most today. 3 was resource implications, and we had kind of an ambitious set of questions around resources that districts invest in their mentoring programs. That was a challenging area to gather data and to have all respondents sort of look at the way they spend resources on these programs the same way. That created challenges. Finally, we did ask some questions around what are the key barriers districts face with regard to providing mentoring, and we'll show you the results of that one in a little bit. So the survey items around district goals for mentoring ask questions around were they interested in increasing teacher proficiency, leadership opportunities for mentors, reduce teacher turnover, increase satisfaction of new teachers with the district induction program. All these were important goals, it turns out, for districts. But we wanted to ask that just to have a sense of where people fell in terms of their priorities. The section around components, this bulleted list were some of the key areas that we talked about. And when we look at types of staff who provide mentoring, a lot of that had to do with whether they were full-time, part-time, or no-release mentors, or whether they were district administrators providing mentoring. We asked questions around whether mentors teach in the same subject area, around the length of the mentoring program, whether it was 1 year, more than 1 year, or 2 years, whether there was a requirement for dedicated time for mentoring to occur during the day, things like training. We also asked questions around whether mentors serve in an evaluative role, and that piece was important in some ways because people in our alliance believe that in order to build a relationship of trust between the mentor and the mentee, it might be better for the mentor to not be involved in the teacher's evaluation. So a lot of the questions that were in the survey were driven by research, and some of them were driven by alliance member priority areas. When we looked at survey items around resource implications, and the ones we'll talk about, we did try and gather data on some of these other costs, the cost of district oversight of the program, training costs, and things like that. And we found quite a wide variation in what was being reported to us. And I think one of our conclusions coming out of this work is that additional research would probably be very helpful to drill down more specifically than what we could do in a sort of an online survey environment to find out exactly where the cost drivers are for districts in each of these areas. Some of the data that we gathered through the survey on things like cost of district oversight of the program, it didn't appear reliable just through the survey that we collected, reliable enough for us to include in the report. But it suggested that future research on this could be very useful because, as we'll talk about later, the one barrier that comes up that districts talk about is the lack of resources to invest in mentoring programs. And as I just mentioned, we had several questions around barriers, and we'll talk about the results there. The barriers that we identified by talking to districts were in several key areas around resources, around program administration, and accountability and monitoring systems. And then the last step that we conducted in creating the survey was to evaluate the draft. And we did that by having multiple webinars with state leaders to talk through the different drafts of the survey. We also did a pilot with 1 to 2 district leaders in each state to ask questions such as, was the survey item, does it make sense? Are there sufficient answer choices to allow the survey taker to answer the way they need to? Are the questions written in a leading or a misleading way? Is it too long overall, and can it be completed in a reasonable amount of time? These are all things that we considered and got direct input from districts in each state before the final release. So when we did go to release the survey, there were 5 states, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. We had almost 1,400 surveys that went out across those 5 states. And our target was to get a 70% response rate, which we thought was pretty aggressive. And we actually got exactly a 70% response rate with 970 responses. So nearly 1,000 districts are included in the data that we're going to talk about, in the next slide. REL Central did quite a bit of support working internally with state leaders to help think about how to analyze and discuss the data that we were finding from the survey. And we weren't allowed to release any of the findings until the report was finally approved, which happened in April of this year. But the response rate piece was something that we worked hard to get by sending out several reminders over the course of a 2-week window, and just wanted everyone to know that the nearly 1,000 districts are included in the data. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the findings. And as you look at these slides, some of them are looking across all 5 states together, and then some of them we break down into state by state. This first slide looks at all 5 states. This one's about 874 district responses. And the question is around the release time that teachers have. And what most districts report, nearly 70%, is that mentoring is provided primarily by full-time teachers with no release time. And again, one reason this is important is because research suggests that giving release time to mentors might be an effective way to enhance mentoring. And the reason for that is because it gives them a chance during the school day to not have to be teaching their own classes at the same time as they're supporting a mentee. They would have time to be released from their normal instructional duties, either part-time or for a full day, to observe and work with their mentees. But in the survey, we found 70%, 69% said mentors are full-time teachers with no release time. About 11% said they were full-time teachers partially released from teaching. 9% indicated school-based administrators. And only about 3% indicated that mentors were full-time teachers that were fully released from their teaching responsibilities. So, again, that's a significant piece of data to think about when, in terms of research on what is effective and sort of practical implications of how challenging it might be for full-time teachers to provide effective support to mentees when they're teaching a full-time course load. This slide actually provides state-by-state results of that same question. And what you can see is that the percentage, well, one thing we found looking at the data is that the percentage of districts across states that say mentoring is provided primarily by teachers that get full release time did not vary very much. It was between 0 and 3% across the states. But what this shows is that in 4 of the 5 states, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and South Dakota, more than 60% of districts said mentoring is primarily given by full-time teachers with no release time. And when you look at those numbers, it was about 72% in Kansas, 76% in Missouri, 62% in Nebraska, 48% in North Dakota, and around 66% in South Dakota. So that just gives you an idea of how it looks across these states on that particular question. We also asked questions around how long mentoring lasts. And again, as we've said several times, this is because of what research suggests might be important. And that 2 years of mentoring support can have a significant effect in improving teacher performance and student performance. The survey, though, shows that more than 1/3 of the districts about 36%, when you look at that top darker blue bar, do not provide any sort of mentoring support after the first year. And when you look at the second grouping there, the top blue bar, about 41% say that support declines after the first year. So in more than 3/4 of districts, about 77% of them, that means less than 2 years is being provided. The last block there shows around 23% say that mentoring stays the same after the first year, meaning there's at least 2 years of mentoring provided. So, it raises an interesting question. What that means, what are some of the driving factors? Is it a resource issue? Where is the connection to research in terms of the need for more than 1 year of support? And it just provides an interesting piece of data to talk about. One thing that I wanted to point out was if you look at the sort of darker gray line for Missouri, Missouri looks a little different than the other states. In Missouri, a much smaller block says that mentoring is not provided after the first year, and overall around 42% of districts say that mentoring stays the same after the first year. And what's a little different about Missouri is they have a state policy in place that says districts should provide more than 1 year of mentoring. And that seems to be having an impact on district policy, although not everyone even in Missouri is providing 2 years. But it does raise a question of, what's the role of state policy in promoting specific district policies and practices that we see are supported in research, and what are the challenges associated with such policies. And we'll try and talk about that a little bit when we get to the state leader conversation at the end. Across all 5 states, about half of the districts require mentors to observe mentees. So that top blue bar for all states is about 52%. And then there was a little bit of a range from the other states. You had Kansas at 51, Missouri at 73, and again, Missouri looks higher because they have standards in place, which also talk about mentors observing mentees. And Nebraska at around 22, North Dakota at 52, and South Dakota at 30. We will talk, we're looking at training, and when you look across all 5 states, and again, this is in the context of research suggesting the importance of training, about 32% of districts say they require mentors to receive training. So, a little less than a third. There was some variation across states as you look at the data. About 11 to 12% said that training was required in Nebraska and South Dakota, and between 37 and 43% of districts in the other 3 states said that training was required. So it'd be interesting to do more research to find out sort of what are the typical backgrounds and experience that mentors have who work with mentees. We have one question that just came in asking why only 5 states in this survey. And those are the 5, we worked actually with all 7 states in the region, but 5 of them decided to release the survey on their own and to gather the data. And so that's what we have talking about today. Looking at stipends. Across the 5 states, about half of the districts actually provide stipends to mentors, around 54%. There's some variation again. Missouri is the highest there at 71%, Kansas at 59%, Nebraska at 24%, North Dakota 46%, and South Dakota 37%. And as we talk about barriers in a couple slides, lack of stipends is one of the things that, and lack of resources contribute to these results. The average stipend that was reported across all the districts that provided stipends was $476 per mentee. And that's just something to think about across all the districts that responded. The next couple slides will talk about barriers. And what we asked respondents to do was rate on a scale of 1 to 5 the degree to which a set of factors were barriers to their ability to deliver kind of adequate mentoring programs. And they had to have a 3 for it to rise to the level of an actual barrier. So let's take a look at those. And hopefully you can see all these. We have these kind of listed from highest level barrier to lowest. And really the only one that, when looking across all 5 states, that top blue line, that hit the level of a barrier, number 3 rating there, was lack of funding. The top 3 in terms of having the highest rating were all resource related though. Lack of funding, lack of time to provide mentoring, lack of stipends for mentoring. Those are all the highest rated in terms of challenges. And in some cases, in places like South Dakota, you can see the light blue line at the bottom. Districts in South Dakota all rated those as being barriers. Districts in Kansas, too, were much higher in terms of rating, lack of funding and lack of stipends. Some of the other areas that we asked about barriers, lack of training, lack of reporting systems to track mentoring delivery, lack of qualified mentors, a lack of system to assign mentors, and a lack of support from teachers' unions. For the most part, these did not reach the level of a barrier other than you see there in South Dakota, lack of mentor training and sort of lack of adequate reporting systems to track mentoring, delivery, and content. Those did reach the level of barrier in that state. But you get the sense, you get the idea of kind of resources being the primary challenge that districts are reporting in terms of why they would like to impacting their ability to deliver the programs they want. Okay. So a few implications, and I think we've touched on these, so I'm going to go through these a little quicker. If a majority of districts indicate that mentoring is provided by full-time teachers who receive no release time, what does that mean, since mentoring suggests more release time is important? The same goes for providing 2 years of mentoring. And what can we do as policymakers and education leaders to disseminate information to districts that discusses the effects or the potential benefits of changing their policies? Is it possible for education leaders to identify districts or states such as Missouri that have policies in place that support some of these practices, and talk about using them as case studies, and to talk about cost and return on investment for some of these policies? And the same would hold true for the question around, are mentors required to observe mentees? Are mentors required to receive training? If research indicates that these are areas that can enhance programs, is there a way that leaders could explore links in a way that would resonate with districts to talk about releasing mentors and finding the resources to make that possible, because cost is a factor, providing substitute teachers and things like that are probably barriers for why districts are not able to implement all these practices. Next. And finally, when we look at stipends and barriers and things like that to implementing strong programs, when we look at the survey responses, what are some potential next steps? And can state leaders work to develop a clear understanding of why so many districts are not able to provide stipends? And sharing research findings on the impacts of those decisions. And could we look at districts that do offer stipends and work to gather data on costs and, again, return on investment to help build the case for those types of approaches? We have one question that came in asking, with regard to stipends, is that in addition to the salary for teachers? And the answer is yes. The stipend was, when we talked about stipends in the survey, that was sort of in addition to whatever their normal pay was. That was specifically a stipend for serving as a mentor. And I just want to, introduce the folks who are joining us today. We have 3 folks who were, really instrumental in helping carry out the survey and participating in all the webinars as we designed the survey, and then agreeing to kind of talk with us today. So we have Linda Dooling, who's the Director of Professional Development with the Office of Educator Quality at the Missouri Department of Education and Elementary and Secondary Education. She leads the state's efforts to design policies and ensure districts have quality mentoring programs in place. And she's been there since 2001 and has been with the department for 18 years. And then we have Sharon Katt, who is a career educator, including teaching in rural comprehensive high schools, and she works in the Nebraska Department of Education as the Senior Administrator for Adult Program Services. And so she works directly with educator preparation and certification systems and in collaboration with other colleagues to try and strengthen the teaching profession. And then third, we have Laurie Stenehjem, who's served for the past 7 years as the Teacher Support System Coordinator for the North Dakota Education Standards and Practices Board. And there she works to support the needs of educators, including leading a statewide program to mentor new teachers. So thank you very much, all 3 of you, for joining us. And I want to ask, first of all, and I'll start with Laurie, and this is really a question for all 3 of the state leaders. What are some of the key challenges facing each of your states overall with regard to the educator workforce? And are these challenges related to recruitment, retention, or both? If you could talk about that and how they're evolving over time, that would be great.
Thank you, Dale. This is Laurie Stenehjem from North Dakota. One of the things that I think is important for me to point out is that when we did this survey, we asked people in North Dakota to answer the survey outside of the state mentoring program that we provide. We're very fortunate in North Dakota that our state provides funding for a mentoring program for first-year teachers, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But this particular survey, we were asking them outside of what the state provides for our first-year teachers, what do you as a district provide? And we had some overlap in that, and so that makes our figures a little bit confusing for us, because people sometimes answered about our state program and sometimes what their districts were doing. But in North Dakota, over the last few years, we've had a real boom cycle because of energy and agriculture prices, and we have moved recently into a not boom cycle. And so that has created certainly some workforce issues for us in teaching, particularly trying to find enough teachers to staff our schools in our oil boom areas. And it's an issue for all of our rural districts, particularly, somewhat in our larger schools, but particularly for our rural districts. So we have had a recruitment and retention committee meeting at the state level over the last year or so. We're working on that concern. One of the major things that they have looked at is changing the requirements to allow people to teach outside of areas that they are not formally trained for. And so we have a significant number of teachers filling positions that they are not formally trained for. We do not have any mandated mentoring in our state. It is up to districts to provide that or to choose whether or not they're going to provide that, which creates some interesting kinds of things happening because some districts participate in our program and others have their own programs, and some don't provide really anything for their new folks. So it's really all positions. our board has actually declared all teaching positions in the state to be shortage areas. But of course, like with everyone else, there are certain areas, math, science, career and technical areas, special education, where there are more shortages than other ones. And we see these shortages particularly, as I said, in our rural schools and our hard-to-staff schools, which would include the schools on our Native American reservations.
Great, thank you. How about Sharon Katt in Nebraska, in terms of the key challenges that your state faces in terms of the educator workforce?
Thank you, Dale. I think our key challenge is beginning to become a recruitment issue. We do not see, as we're hearing nationally, we do not see people coming to educator preparation in the numbers that they used to. And so I think because we don't have that pipeline like we used to, we're going to have to be a bit more intentional around making sure that we retain the teachers that we do have. As Laurie indicated, we are also in looking for teachers in almost any content area, with a few exceptions. We're finding that our rural and geographically isolated areas are particularly hard-pressed to attract teachers, new to the profession teachers. It's a sense of isolation for those new teachers, and typically they're looking to stay in more populous areas. I would also rush to say that isn't to say that our highly populated areas are not struggling with shortages as well. It is also our issue of, as we look to figuring out how to make sure that we put effective teachers into the classroom, that many times we are also looking at asking people to teach out of an endorsement area that they've been prepared to teach in, or attracting individuals who have not had a strong formal preparation for teaching. Those folks certainly can bring something to the classroom, but the support of a mentoring program becomes especially critical as we bring those individuals up to speed.
Thank you. And how about Linda in Missouri? The same kind of question from Missouri's perspective.
In Missouri, I think we're facing some of the same challenges. I mean, when people ask us if we're having trouble recruiting or retaining teachers, we say yes. We find our shortage areas are geographically. So they could be, we might need a math teacher in one area, a special ed teacher in another region. We might need a counselor. So we have enough certified people. We just do not have them in the right locations. And that's a concern because people are not always willing to relocate, or they cannot relocate due to a spouse or something else. We know we don't need elementary teachers because we have a ton of them. So we could send somebody else's way. But we've been talking a lot about this issue in the state, and it's part of our equity plan. And one of our solutions is talking to school districts about growing your own, encouraging those students that we find in high schools that maybe don't know what they want to do, might have some potential for teaching, and start grooming those young people to come back and teach in our own buildings, and trying to find ways of creating scholarships and things like that to help those students go on to school to become educators so that they'll come back to our own districts, and also kind of hone and move them into those fields that we know we might need in the future in that district specifically, as a way of maybe bridging our gap. I think that's it's a plus. I really believe that it could work. We have several school districts that have been doing that for several years and have found that it's working for them, that their folks are coming back and teaching in their district. Some of the districts are up to 25% of homegrown staff now. So I think that could be one solution for folks, is start thinking about those grow your own opportunities in that area. I mean, in our state, I feel like we have got a good start on mentoring. Like you said, our results looked a bit different. So it bothers me in one way because it should look even more different. We do require 2 years of mentoring, and each year should be the same year. We don't slough off the second year. So I think that's very important. We do require observations, both for the mentee and the mentor in those classrooms. We do require mentoring training for all mentors. Now, our problem would be that accountability piece, that follow-up piece to make sure school districts are following through with that effort. But I think we've got some of the good pieces in place. We just need the follow-up on our end.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great. I have another question for the three of you, and just looking at some of the report's findings from the survey that we just talked about, where you sort of have, large percentages of teachers, of districts that don't provide release time to teachers, or that might not require training for mentors, or mentor observations of mentees, or thinking about mentoring time decreasing after the first year. Which of those findings, if any, are of the greatest concern from your perspective of state leaders? And are there any potential solutions that states or districts are thinking about, or that you think they should consider? I'll start with Laurie again, if that's okay.
Well, in North Dakota, as I said, we do have a statewide program that is funded from the state general fund to provide mentors for first-year teachers. And our statewide program does require mentor training. It provides for one-on-one conferencing time and observations and recording of new teachers, etc. So within our program, I think that we do meet a lot of those things, although we are only for first-year teachers. One of the things that I think is a real issue is that as much as we are a local control state, where we want school districts to have their own choices, the reality is that in small schools, and even in our larger districts in the state, there generally aren't any people available who have time to really research and develop expertise in how to provide mentoring. And so it's clear to me that at the state level or somewhere above the district level, there needs to be some organization of those things to provide those for districts. There's no one in the district who can develop a mentor training, a whole mentor training program, for example. And so it seems to me that it's really valuable to have those things provided at the state level and available to schools. We have many districts who don't have a new teacher every year in their district. So someone needs to be able to develop that expertise. Otherwise, we end up with what we call mentoring light, which is sort of a chance thing, that we ask someone to be the mentor and they agree to do it because they're good people and they do their best, but they really don't have any expertise in that. So one of the things we find in our district or in our state then, because we're limited to that first-year teacher, is that there is a real need to provide mentoring and support for teachers who are new to the district but have some experience teaching, and also to those teachers who have been given a new assignment. So possibly they've moved into a special education position or out of a special education position into classrooms. And so there's a real need there. One of the solutions is that because of our state program, we have trained a lot of mentors. And so districts can make use of them when they're not mentoring new teachers in our program. There are a lot of teachers in the state who are trained and ready to provide support for those other kinds of teachers.
Great, thank you. How about Sharon in Nebraska, when you think about some of the findings from the survey What are any of those sort of, jump out at you as sort of, the key challenges that you think should be addressed? And in what ways should states and districts try and tackle those?
It occurred to me as I looked at the list that they are so interrelated that it was very difficult for me to identify one or the other. But Nebraska does not happen to be a state that has statutory, regulatory, or financial support for mentoring programs. So as I prepared for this, I did reach out to across the state a number of entities to ask what they do. And the really rewarding piece of that exercise was to find that there are some pretty awesome programs out there that are developed because they are the right thing to do. I would be lying to you if I said money wouldn't help, because that could be about rewarding professionalism, rewarding excellence. But what we do find is that there's a message that needs to be crafted, I think, which is about this is one way that we begin to look at retaining good teachers. This is one way that we recruit teachers to schools because they see it as a culture of collegiality. It's a climate that they want to work in because of that collaborative nature. They see it as opportunities to be teacher leaders in their districts, and in fact that will be something that Nebraska will look at, developing a teacher leader program, something we do not have. Nebraska's accountability system is fairly new, and we're looking at ways in which we can reward districts for not only their work with student test scores and participation rates and graduation rates, but also to ask schools to look at what it is that they do on a day-to-day basis that helps to document that they are effective, continuously improving schools. And certainly if we can back mentoring into that as being one of the ways that they can receive recognition and rewards, it won't give them any more money. It won't give them any more time. It won't make them any less rural or urban. Same sorts of problems that Laurie mentioned for rural schools. But, urban schools have to set their priorities as well. So all the way around, come back to we do have some good things happening here because it is the right thing to do. And I think all of us as educators should celebrate some of that as well.
Thank you. And Linda, how about from Missouri, when you look at the kind of survey results, which, if any, are kind of greatest concern to you from Missouri's perspective?
Well, I guess if I were going, I'm kind of like Sharon. I don't think that it's hard to separate the pieces. I guess my greatest concern is we have mentoring standards that our districts are required to go by. They are supposed to be putting all those pieces in place, and all the pieces that were named are in our mentoring program standards. And so I guess my concern is we have districts that are choosing not to do it. Now, I guess the underlying piece to that is, why are we not doing it? Is it because of funding and resources? Is it because they don't have the time? They don't know where to get training. After the survey results came out, I mean, we haven't just not done anything with this. I mean, since that period, we have updated our mentoring standards. We have worked on, Missouri also requires all new teachers to have a beginning teacher assistance program. That was in statute, and it's always interesting when some of those things are in statute. It is a certification requirement, and yet we would get call after call. What's in a beginning teacher assistance program? It wasn't defined. And so we spent this year with a group of educators from higher education, from K-12 school districts, from our teacher and administrator associations, working on what do we mean by beginning teacher assistance program. And so we have completed that piece, fleshed that out so that we know what that program would look like that they have to have, as well as our 2-year mentoring program. We are in the process of working on teacher induction now, which is going to be a 4-year program, because we truly believe if we're going to retain our teachers, it's not just money, it's that support that they receive on site. And so we are working on that. So I guess we are very concerned about all of those, I guess is what I would say. And so we've beefed up everything. So now the test will be if when we roll this out to our school districts, they will understand that this is very, very important work to keep our teachers, because we're not losing as many as some states are, because I've looked at the statistics, but we still lose them in that first 3 to 5 year period. So it is a concern. It's part of our equity plan, and I am hoping that we are putting some more pieces in place that will help us continue on the right road.
Well, thank you very much. That's excellent, and I think a great way to kind of wrap up our discussion, because we're out of time. And I just want to really thank Linda and Sharon and Laurie for giving us your time and for working with REL Central to produce the survey that gave us this data.